Harry Potter story from another's perspective. Rowan Barrows and the Forgotten Prophecy, Chapter 12, Christmas. The Hufflepuff common room was a whirl of noise and flying scarves. Trunks banged shut, owls hooted indignantly from their perches, and the smell of toast from breakfast still lingered faintly in the air. Outside, snow drifted past the round windows, piling in soft white heaps against the glass. A small tree stood near the hearth, not grand like the ones Rowan imagined filled the great hall, but warm and slightly crooked. Its branches were decorated with scraps of ribbon, charmed up corns, and the occasional floating candle that bobbed lazily in the air. Rowan lingered beside it, his trunk already packed and waiting by the door. In his hands were a few small parcels, nothing special, at least not in the way magic usually was. He crouched, brushing aside a fallen pine needle, and placed the first carefully beneath the tree. Ollie's. The wrapping was uneven. Rowan had tried to fold it properly, but one corner refused to sit flat. Inside was a small, worn field guide on magical creatures he'd found tucked away in a shop, with a few notes scribbled in the margins where he thought Ollie might like them. He hesitated, then nudged it further under the branches. The next parcel was neater. Justin's. Rowan turned it once in his hands before setting it down. The gobstones inside were heavier than the school ones, polished smooth and cool to the touch. He wasn't entirely sure they were better, but they felt like they should be. Maybe now Justin would stop losing to Ernie, or at least stop complaining about it. Rowan paused. He had thought about getting something for Cedric, but every idea had felt wrong the moment it formed. Cedric didn't seem like someone who needed things. He already carried himself like he belonged, like he knew exactly where he was going. Rowan exhaled quietly. In the end, he had left it. Honestly, Ollie muttered beside him a moment later, dropping onto his trunk. They should teach packing at Hogwarts. I'd get an outstanding. You'd fail, Rowan said, snapping his own trunk shut, because you'd charm it to eat your clothes. I call that innovation, Ollie said brightly. Around them, the rest of the first years were in various stages of chaos. Justin was searching frantically for his scarf. Ernie was explaining, for the third time, the proper way to fold robes, and Zacharias was loudly insisting that everyone else's belongings were taking up too much space. Near the fire, Cedric Diggory was helping a pair of second years tie up parcels for home, calm as ever. Mum's going to cry when I get back, I bet, Ollie said, suddenly fastening his case. She always does. Says I look thinner, Rowan laughed. You've eaten 6 chocolate frogs a day since September. That's training food, Ollie said firmly. A voice drifted over from the corner of the room. Can't imagine why everyone's so excited to leave. Rowan glanced over. Margot sat cross-legged on the rug, a book balanced on her knees, her dark hair falling forward as she wrote. It's quiet here at Christmas, she added. Peaceful. You're staying? Rowan asked. She shrugged without looking up. Mum's in France. Hogwarts is warmer than her house. Ollie blinked. That's cheery, he said sarcastically. Margot's mouth twitched faintly. Have fun freezing in the Muggle world. Rowan wasn't entirely sure whether it was a joke. Before he could answer, Cedric clapped his hands. All right, Hufflepuffs. If you're heading home, trunks to the door, carriages leave in 15. The room burst into motion. Laughter, footsteps, last-minute scrambling. Sebastian the owl swooped low overhead with an indignant hoot, narrowly missing Ollie's head. Rowan heaved his trunk upright, heart fluttering with the excitement of seeing home again, Eleanor waiting by the window, his mother pretending not to be as pleased as she really was. At the door, Professor Sprout stood in her thick winter cloak, smiling fondly at the chaos. Ah, there you are, Rowan, she said as he passed. Before you go, dear, I have something for you. She pulled a small parcel-wrapped pot from her pocket. "Thanks," Rowan replied, looking a little confused as he left and no one else received a gift. As they stepped out into the snow-covered courtyard, the castle loomed above them, chimneys trailing thin wisps of smoke into the pale December sky. The carriages waited by the gates, and the air was alive with the chatter of students heading home. Rowan turned for one last look at the castle. Through the frost on the windows, the glow of the Hufflepuff common room still flickered faintly, warm and golden. The train ride home felt shorter than the journey that had taken him to Hogwarts. Or maybe it was just that he knew where he was going this time. The compartment was full, bags shoved into racks, chocolate frog wrappers scattered across the seats, and the constant hum of voices overlapping in excited bursts. First years compared their favourite classes, arguing over which professor was the strictest, while older students flicked through famous witch and wizard cards, trading loudly and accusing each other of cheating. Outside, the world had turned to winter. Snow swept across the countryside in soft, endless sheets, blurring trees and hills into streaks of white and silver. Every so often, a frozen stream flashed past like glass catching the light. Rowan sat by the window, watching it all drift by. Ollie sat opposite him, already halfway through a pumpkin pasty, crumbs dusting the front of his robes. "I'm telling you," Ollie said through a mouthful, "they taste better on the way home. It's a fact." "That's not how food works," Rowan said, though he was smiling. "It is," Ollie insisted. "It's the feeling. You're not eating it for hunger. You're eating it for celebration." Zacharias leaned across from the corner seat. "That might be the most ridiculous thing you've said all term." "Wrong," Ollie said immediately. "That was when I suggested we could train Sebastian to do our homework." "That was a good idea," Rowan said sarcastically. Zacharias groaned. "You're both impossible." Laughter rippled through the compartment. For a while, Rowan let himself sink into it, but every now and then his eyes drifted back to the window, to the snow, to the distant shapes of villages passing by. Home. The trolley came rattling past again, and Ollie immediately bought more than he could reasonably carry. "You're going to regret that," Rowan said, eyeing the pile. "I regret nothing," Ollie replied proudly. 10 minutes later, he was groaning and leaning back in his seat. "I regret some things." As the train began to slow, the mood shifted. Voices lifted. Trunks were dragged down from racks. Cloaks were pulled on hurriedly. Scarves wrapped tight against the cold waiting outside. Rowan stood, steadying himself as the train jolted gently along the tracks. His stomach flipped, not unpleasantly, just differently. Excited. Nervous. Something in between. "You'll write, yeah?" Ollie said, trying to sound casual and not quite managing it. Rowan slung his bag over his shoulder. "Maybe." "That's not reassuring." "You'll survive," Rowan answered. Ollie huffed. The train pulled into the station with a long hiss of steam. For a moment everything felt still. Then movement. Doors slid open, voices spilled out, and the platform filled with noise and colour as students poured onto the ground. Cold air hit Rowan instantly, sharp and clean, carrying the smell of snow and smoke. Families lined the platform, waving, calling names, pulling students into tight embraces. The crowd moved like the tide, parting and closing again, a blur of coats and scarves and laughter. Rowan stepped down onto the platform, and then he saw her. His mother stood near the barrier, scarf pulled tight around her neck, her hair damp with falling snow. She wasn't waving like some of the others, just watching, searching, waiting. Rowan's chest tightened. Without thinking, he pushed forward, weaving through the crowd, ducking past a group of older students and sidestepping a trunk that nearly took out his ankle. The crowd parted just enough, and suddenly, he was there. "Rowan." Her voice softened as she said his name. She crouched slightly. "You look older," she said. Rowan tried to hide his smile. "Do I?" "A bit," she said, though her hand didn't move from his shoulder. "Don't get used to it." There was a pause, not awkward, just full. Then she straightened. "Come on. Your Gran's been up since dawn, fussing about your room." Rowan nodded, glancing back once, just for a second, at the train, at the swirl of students and steam and noise. Back at number 22 Mossfield Way, the house felt smaller somehow, but warmer too. A thin garland of tinsel drooped along the mantelpiece, the kettle whistled on the stove, and Eleanor was in her armchair, wrapped in a blanket with Candy purring across her knees. When she saw Rowan, her face broke into a smile that seemed to light up the whole room. "There's my clever boy," she said, opening her arms. "Come give your Gran a hug." Rowan rushed to her, nearly tripping over Candy's tail. The cat yowled in protest and leapt to the back of the chair, glaring down at him like a furry monarch. "You've grown taller," Eleanor said, studying him fondly. "And thinner. Do they not feed you properly in that castle anymore?" Rowan laughed. "There's loads of food, Gran." "Well, you'd best have seconds here, just in case." Mrs. Ashford smiled faintly from the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a tea towel. The next few days passed in a blur of warmth and small, perfect ordinariness. The village was draped in frost, fairy lights blinked faintly through windows, and Mrs. Ashford's van spent most of the holiday parked under a blanket of snow. Rowan helped her hang paper decorations that never quite stayed up, delivered poinsettias to the neighbours, and brought Eleanor endless cups of tea while she knitted scarves that were all the wrong length. Candy followed him everywhere, moving slowly but still managing to trip him at least twice a day. Every evening the three of them would sit by the fire, Mrs. Ashford reading, Eleanor humming softly. Christmas morning dawned pale and frost-bright, the light spilling soft and golden through Rowan's curtains. The house was quiet, but for the pop and crackle of the fire downstairs and the gentle rumble of Candy's purring somewhere near the end of his bed. Rowan blinked sleepily and sat up. At the foot of his bed sat a small but very respectable pile of presents. He smiled. The first was wrapped in paper decorated with unevenly drawn flowers. His mother's handiwork, clearly. Inside was a neat bundle of gardening tools, a new pair of gloves, a small trowel with his initials carved, crookedly, into the handle, and a little packet of bulbs. There was also a note in her neat, sharp handwriting. For when you're home and the world feels too quiet, keep your hands busy and your mind calm. Mum. Rowan grinned, touched in the way only something practical and loving could make you. Next came a small brown box that looked like it had been singed around the edges. The return address read simply, A. Barrows. He lifted the lid, and a puff of golden dust burst into the air, making him sneeze violently. Inside were sweets he'd never seen before. Fizzing fairy bites, the label said, each one shimmering faintly, like the glow of a candle seen through mist. A note was tucked in the corner. Try not to eat them all at once. One made Puck hover for 10 minutes straight. Happy Christmas, Rowan. Dad. Rowan laughed softly, rubbing the back of his nose. He could almost hear his father's voice saying it, half teasing, half proud. The next parcel was from Professor Sprout. The paper was patterned with tiny dancing mandrakes and tied with rough twine. Inside was a small clay pot containing a single dark seed nestled in damp soil and a folded scrap of parchment that read, "A rare seed. Needs patience, warmth, and a little bravery. Rather like you. Merry Christmas, Professor Sprout." Rowan held it up to the light, smiling. The soil smelled faintly of mint and smoke. The next parcel was long and thin, wrapped in paper that looked as though it had been reused at least twice and taped back together in a hurry. Rowan opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass device, part compass, part something else entirely, with a crooked needle that twitched uncertainly instead of pointing north. He turned it in his hands. The needle spun, paused, and pointed directly at Candy. Rowan frowned. Then the note slipped out. It doesn't find north. That'd be boring. Found this within my dad's junk. It supposedly points to whatever's most interesting nearby. Don't break it. Or do, and tell me what happens. Ollie. Rowan let out a quiet laugh. Of course it does, but if it's pointing at candy, I'm not sure it works. The next gift was wrapped very neatly. Crisp edges, careful folds, and tied with proper ribbon. Justin. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, the pages thick and smooth, perfect for writing. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. Thought you might want somewhere proper to keep notes, for spells, or whatever it is you're always deep in thought about. Merry Christmas, Justin. Rowan ran a thumb over the cover, smiling. It felt useful, thoughtful. He set it carefully beside him. Then came the oddest package of all, a lumpen, crumpled bundle tied with far too many knots and string that looked suspiciously like shoelaces. There was a tag stuck upside down that read, "From Puck." Rowan opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sock, not a pair, just one, and not even his size. It looked like it belonged to Candy. There was also a note, written in shaky handwriting that seemed to wobble with pride. Puck hears humans like socks. Merry Christmas, Master Rowan. Rowan burst out laughing so loudly that Candy leapt off the bed in fright and shot under the chair. You absolute genius, he chuckled, holding the sock aloft like a trophy. And finally there was one last parcel, the heaviest of the lot. The tag read simply, "Love, Gran." Rowan peeled back the wrapping slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was a long, narrow case, old but polished to a shine. His breath caught as he opened it. It was his father's guitar, not dusty or broken as it had been, but restored. The wood gleamed warm and honey brown, the strings taut and clean. The small crack along the bass had been mended so finely you could hardly see it. He rushed downstairs. Eleanor was in her armchair by the fire when he came running down, the guitar clutched to his chest. "Gran," he said, his voice a little unsteady, "you fixed it." Eleanor smiled, that quiet, knowing sort of smile that said she'd expected this moment. "Took a bit of magic and a lot of patience," she said, lifting her teacup. "Thought it was time it sang again." Mrs. Ashford was setting out breakfast, pretending not to listen, though the corner of her mouth twitched in a small smile. "Mind you don't wake the neighbours with it," she said softly. Rowan sat by the fire, plucked a few tentative strings, and listened as the sound filled the room, warm, imperfect, alive. Candy climbed onto his lap, tail flicking against the guitar's neck, and Eleanor closed her eyes as though she could still hear Aldrich playing all those years ago. For a long, gentle moment, the house seemed to breathe again. The holidays slipped by in that slow, comfortable way only winter can manage. Days passed in a blur of quiet mornings and glowing fires, afternoons filled with Eleanor humming under her breath while she mended clothes by the window, and evenings when Mrs. Ashford returned from her garden smelling of rosemary and wood smoke. Rowan played his father's guitar most nights softly at first. Eleanor always listened, eyes closed, a little smile at the corners of her mouth. Even his mother stopped pretending she wasn't listening once or twice. But Hogwarts, it seemed, had a way of calling to him even through the snow. The night before he was due to leave, Rowan sat awake at his window. The world outside was white and still, the village tucked beneath its blanket of frost. Candy dozed on the windowsill beside him, tail twitching. Rowan plucked at a soft, uncertain tune and wondered what the voice in the walls had meant, and whether it would still be waiting for him. The next morning came bright and sharp, sunlight glinting on every rooftop. Mrs. Ashford fussed about his scarf. Eleanor reminded him to eat properly, and Candy meowed his opinion from under the table. Before he left, Eleanor pressed a tiny package into his hand, a smooth, polished stone carved with delicate runes. "For luck," she said, "and because your father never listens when I tell him to take care of himself. You can do better than that." Rowan smiled, pocketing the stone carefully. "I will." And then it was time. The train was waiting at the little countryside station. steam clouding the platform and snowflakes drifting in the air. The carriages glowed warm with lamplight and laughter, the sound of hundreds of students returning to the strange, wonderful life inside the castle walls. When Rowan saw the turrets of Hogwarts rising against the evening sky, he felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the kind of excitement that comes from stepping back into a story you hadn't quite finished. Rowan smiled faintly, watching the snow whip past the glass. Hogwarts in winter looked like something out of a snow globe. Icicles hung thick as candles from the eaves, and every morning the great halls shimmered under a ceiling of pale, drifting snowflakes. Even the staircases seemed to creak more kindly, as if the castle itself enjoyed the peace of the cold. Rowan had never seen the castle so quiet. The chatter and chaos of the first term had mellowed into something slower, calmer, though no less strange. Lessons resumed, of course, but they felt softer somehow. Professor Sprout had bundled her class into cloaks and gloves to prune frostweed in the greenhouses. Professor Flitwick demonstrated warming charms that left the room glowing like a hearth. Rowan couldn't stop smiling through most of them. It felt good to be back, and yet the whispers had returned. They weren't constant, not like before, more like stray thoughts brushing past the edge of his mind when the corridors were empty, or when the library's lamps burned low and the snow tapped softly against the glass. He never understood the words, only the feeling they carried. Something lost, something waiting. Ollie noticed, of course. "You've got that face again," he said one evening, dropping into the armchair opposite Rowan in the Hufflepuff common room. "The one that says, 'I'm thinking about something spooky and probably dangerous.'" "I'm not," Rowan said automatically. Ollie raised an eyebrow. "You're absolutely lying. I'm good at telling when people are lying. My little sister is forever lying." Rowan sighed. "Fine. Maybe. I think I just miss home." This was a lie, of course. Ollie groaned and threw his quill at him. "Rowan, I know you're thinking about that crazy portrait again. She'd tell you the moon was a turnip if you stood still long enough. You need to forget about it." Rowan smiled, but the thought didn't leave him. Snow clung to the windowsills, the lake shimmered under a thin sheet of ice, and every breath that escaped into the morning air came out in little clouds. Inside, though, the castle was warm and humming with life again. The holidays were over, trunks were unpacked, fireplaces were roaring, and the great hall smelled of porridge, toast, and wood smoke. Rowan sat among the returning Hufflepuffs, rubbing sleep from his eyes and grinning as Justin Finch Fletchley launched into a dramatic account of his parents' dreadful New Year's Eve party. "They hired a string quartet," Justin moaned, and then told everyone not to dance. Can you imagine? Absolute torture. Across from him, Ollie snorted into his pumpkin juice. "Truly tragic, Fletchley. I can't believe you survived." Rowan laughed, leaning back. For the first time since leaving home, Hogwarts actually felt familiar, noisy, warm, and full of stories. His old life and new one no longer seemed like such distant worlds. A few places down the table, the Hufflepuff girl Margot sat alone with a book propped against the marmalade jar. Her plate was half finished, forgotten beside a pencil she'd been chewing. Something about the stillness around her, everyone else chatting in clusters, her content in the quiet, made Rowan pick up his plate and slide onto the bench opposite her. "You stayed here for Christmas, didn't you?" he asked after a moment. She looked up as though Rowan had took her by surprise. "Oh, yeah. I like it when it's quiet. The castle feels different." Rowan nodded, imagining the echoing corridors and empty classrooms. "Bet it was nice to have all the fires to yourself." The small smile tugged at her mouth. "And all the pudding." That earned a laugh from him. "Next year I might stay just for that." "Anyway," Rowan said, a little quieter now, "I never properly thanked you for the troll." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, setting it carefully on the table in front of her. "I noticed you were nearly out of pages," he added with a small shrug. "Thought you might need another. Merry Christmas." For a moment Margot just stared at it. The usual sharpness in her expression faltered, replaced by something softer, surprise maybe, or something she wasn't used to showing. She looked up at him as if about to say something, but Rowan didn't wait. He gave a small, almost awkward nod, then turned and slipped back down the table toward the others, leaving the notebook in front of her. Behind him, she still hadn't moved. "Where's Ollie?" Rowan asked as he returned to the others. Justin answered. He's seen Professor Kettleburn and ran off to try and convince him to let him study the care of magical creatures again. "Of course he has," Rowan answered with a chuckle. By the end of breakfast, it almost felt like he'd never been away. The chatter, the laughter, the sound of Cedric calling reminders about homework down the table, it all folded neatly back into the rhythm of life at Hogwarts.